your Indian card, but throw your ass in jail. Where's your white man's card? Prove to me that you ain't black. Where's your white man's card?
So I'm John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native on this Tuesday, June 11th. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage, and sometimes we start conversations. We don't do prayers or buffalo speeches. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about culture, the arts, politics, and identity. We may step on a few toes along the way, but our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that is heaped upon us. And we do it all right here live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. But first, let me remind you that our shows are streaming live on our website, which is www.letstalknative.com. We stream the video of the show on Facebook Live, so you can catch us on a number of Facebook group pages. We take the video and we post it up on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV, after the broadcast, and we take the audio and we put it up as a podcast after the broadcast. So you can find this show on any of your favorite podcast platforms, and of course you can find our video of the show on our YouTube channel as well. I'm the host of Let's Talk Native, and I'm assisted by Jake Proud here in studio, who is managing our video and our sound. An interesting show for you today. I have a guest that's joining me remotely. I've got a gentleman who is running for president of the United States. He's Navajo, has lived most of his life in the D.C. area and in different places, and he's taken a shot at trying to become the first Native president of the United States. And of course, we see a post at least once a week about how great it would be to have a Native American president of the United States. I'm not in that camp, so this makes for an interesting conversation. Mark Charles is a public speaker. He has recently done a TED Talk that we'll reference in this conversation, and we'll talk about his vision of what being a Native in the United States is. And we'll just get right to it. So let me go to right to the interview with Mark Charles, candidate for the President of the United States. I want to welcome Mark Charles to Let's Talk Native. Mark Charles is a candidate for the U.S. presidency for 2020. He's an author, public speaker, and I want to find out more about what is involved with this candidacy. What Mark is trying to accomplish here, and talk to him a little bit about some of what his messaging has been. So, Mark, I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native.
Well, hey, John, thank you very much. It's good to be here. And I would very much like to just introduce myself traditionally so that my relatives listening on the air can know who I am. But hey, Mark Charles Yunus, yeah. Sinba Kedina initially, do Tohiglini Bashichin, Sinba Kedina Dashiche, do Todachi ni Dashanella. Thank you, John, for allowing me to introduce myself. In the Navajo culture, when we introduce ourselves, we always give our 4 clans. And we're a matrilineal people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. Now, my mother's mother is American of Dutch heritage, and so I say Sinba Kedina. Translated, that means I'm from the Wooden Shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Sinba Kedina. Then my fourth clan, my father's father, is Todachitni. That's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people.
Okay. So where do you live first? So we'll start right there.
I moved to Washington, D.C. with my family. We moved here about 4 years ago. And we moved here from the Navajo Reservation. We were living in Fort Defiance, right near the capital of our nation, which is Window Rock. Okay.
And you do identify yourself as Navajo?
Yes. Well, I identify myself as both the son of my mother and the son of my father. So my mother is American of Dutch heritage, and so I identify myself as that, as well as identify myself as the son of my father, who is Navajo. So again, because our people are matrilineal, if I did not acknowledge my mother, I would not be acknowledging my identity as a Navajo person. So I tell people, the way I just introduced myself, that I am the son of both of my parents
Sure.
and all four of my grandparents.
Sure. All right. So, you've announced it's a couple of weeks in now. I assume that you plan to run for the presidency of the United States. Now, are you running as a native person? Obviously, you're running as an American because only an American can be a president of the United States. So, would you characterize yourself as running as a native person running for the presidency?
Yes, I would. In my press release that I sent out last week and is available on my website, I identify that I am a dual citizen of both the United States and the Navajo Nation.
Okay.
And so I am very much running not only as an American citizen, but as a citizen of the Navajo Nation and as someone who carries the concerns and the burdens and the well-being of that community within my campaign.
Okay. And we'll talk about that. We'll talk about your why exactly you're running. But I do want to. I saw your TEDx talk from January, and I know quite a bit about the doctrine of discovery. I've spoken of it, and I've had several guests, including folks like Stephen Newcomb and others on my program a number of times. And as I listen to you talk about the doctrine of discovery, and I agree with much of your characterization of the doctrine of discovery, but it's the I guess it's the conclusion that I'm a little confused about, because I mean the doctrine of discovery, as you well state, is a racist, a white supremacist doctrine born out of the church that all of the denominations of Christianity have embraced at some level, although many of them have repudiated it in modern times, but certainly whether it was the Anglican Church of Great Britain or whether it was the Catholic churches of Portugal and Spain and others, they embraced this notion that under the doctrine of discovery, a Christian nation of Europe could claim the land, the freedom, the lives, the possessions of a pagan people, and as you well stated in your TED Talk, that they could regard non-Christians as less than human, and so be able to promote things like slavery and genocide and the whole bit. I guess when you get to the place in your TED Talk where you start talking about Native people not being a part of We the People, I get that too, and including Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution, where our people are not included in part of the Constitution. But I don't view it as that being some sort of travesty. I mean, for me, when I look at the U.S. Constitution, where we are mentioned 3 times. One, that the President of the United States can negotiate treaties with us, just like the President could do that with foreign governments. Where Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce in and among several states with foreign nations and with Native people. It's still not disrespectful, and the fact that we are not included as a taxable people for apportionment of taxes or representation of Congress. I don't think that our people were asking for that to be a part of that We the People. So when you call out the doctrine of discovery on the We the People issue, I'm not sure. I mean, maybe you can offer some clarity on why you think we need to address the doctrine of discovery to address the fact that Native people, frankly, may not even want to be a part of the United States, but certainly are not.
Well, thank you for giving me a chance to respond to that. And I want to even saying how much I appreciate the work of Steve Newcomb. His book, Pagans in the Promised Land, was one of the early books I was exposed to probably almost a decade ago. And, he has been doing a tremendous job of trying to bring the issue of the doctrine of discovery really to the forefront of the national dialogue. And I appreciate the work he's done. I think his book, everyone should read it, and I recommend it most every place I go. So, I want to acknowledge that there is a large disagreement, a large divide within our Native communities, within Indian country. There are some who believe don't want to be a part of this nation, and we just want to have our traditional sovereignty back. And there are others who very much accept.
But how does that
and
work?
Embrace.
Mark, if you don't, but how can you reconcile those two things? How can we claim sovereignty and distinction and yet be a part of of the we the people? That's what I'm wrestling with.
Well, that's the challenge. Well, what I'm saying is there's people coming to the table from both sides of that argument. I'm Navajo, and our Navajo and people and other tribes fought as code talkers throughout both World War I and World War II. Many of our code talkers literally came from the boarding schools where their languages and their culture were being beaten out of them, and they went into the U.S. Marine Corps, and they used the language that they were able to retain under extreme duress and use that to help this nation win a very major war.
Yeah, but wouldn't you consider residential schools as almost conditioning our people for the U.S. military in the first place?
Well, that was the goal of the boarding schools, was to put them into these military-style boarding schools to remove our language and remove our culture. It was a forced assimilation program that the nation was enacting on Native peoples to assimilate us. And yet, many of our people went on to say, okay, well, we still want to fight on behalf of this land, on behalf of Turtle Island.
Yeah, but
many of those people were not recognized. Their sacrifice was not recognized for many years, and many of our code talkers had to live almost in the shadows for a long time because the country wasn't willing yet to acknowledge the work that they had done. It wasn't until just a few decades ago that they began to acknowledge publicly the sacrifice and the work of the code talkers.
But even the enlistment into the U.S. military is still a part of almost a part of that assimilation process that but that came out of the residential schools and, of course, policies before that. So, I mean, to suggest that enlisting was an act that that wasn't consistent with the assimilation is not exactly accurate either, right?
Well, what I'm trying to acknowledge is that there are people within our community who have, I don't know if I want to say the word embrace, but acknowledge that, yeah, we are now citizens, or at least partial citizens of this nation, and have fought and sacrificed and invested in whether it's serving in the military, whether it's voting, whether it's getting an education. We have participated as citizens within this country.
Well, so in other words, I mean, the assimilation policy was successful.
You might want to say that.
Well, I mean, because you actually, I remember in the beginning of your TED Talk, you actually referred to the Pamunkey and the Piscataway and the Haudenosaunee as having been ethnically cleansed, and we could argue that under this policy of assimilation, ethnic cleansing was the broad-based U.S. policy that would not only create the residential schools, but a disproportionate amount of enlisting in the military, and frankly, even running for office, whether it's Congress like Deborah Haaland or Sharice David, or you running for president.
Yes, and I would say the boarding school that policy was enacted because the nation was by and large losing its stomach for the outright genocide. This is what the Indian problem that Pratt was addressing when he laid out his argument for the boarding schools. This is just in 1892, just a couple of years after Wounded Knee, and the nation had been fighting, led by presidents like Abraham Lincoln, a very genocidal period of warfare against Native peoples. So implicit or so direct was this battle that even Peter Burnett, who was the governor of California in his first State of the State address in 1851, he said that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, must be expected. While we cannot anticipate this result, but with painful regret, the inevitable destiny of the race is beyond the power or wisdom of man to avert. And then 2 years after signing the Pacific Railway Act, Abraham Lincoln literally ethnically cleanses the Dakota and the Winnebago from Minnesota, the Cheyenne and Arapaho from Colorado and Wyoming, and the New Mexico and Mescalero Apache from the territory of New Mexico, which are 3 of the primary routes for the Transcontinental Railway. And
but residential schools, by the definition of genocide, are really a continuation of genocide. We could argue that it was perhaps more compassionate because it wasn't mass slaughter, but by any definition of genocide, residential schools still qualify.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's what Pratt lays out, which is let's stop killing them and let's now kill the Indian to save the man. And then he builds a very white supremacist argument, borrowing from the experience of slavery, when he says, as horrible as slavery was, it bestowed upon the African the greatest blessing they've ever received, which is it brought them from cannibalism and savagery in Africa to partial citizenship and English speaking in America. And so, I completely agree. This residential boarding school system was absolutely rooted in this abhorrent lie of white supremacy that now it's lost. This nation had lost most of its stomach for outright slaughter of people. And now it was working on a cultural genocide of let's kill the Indian to save the man.
Right. Well,
which was, again, more socially palatable than the outright slaughter.
Although
that was the Indian problem that they were trying to address in '92, which is we still want the land, the Indians are still there, so but it's not as good to just slaughter them anymore. So let's try to find another way.
Well, and again, elimination by another policy, and in fact, we could go right to the Indian Citizenship Act, which at the time, if you looked at it from an international law standpoint, this idea of denationalizing of people was already being talked of as a war crime in 1913. So in 1924, when they passed the Indian Citizenship Act, it is still essentially, for all intents and purposes, a war crime, and that's all going on in the midst of residential school training and really
absolutely
and all of that. So, all right,
then on top of that, you don't even get the right to vote for the Navajo and other tribes in Arizona and New Mexico until 1948.
Well,
so even though we became citizens in 24, we were not given the full rights of citizenship. And this is the whole point of my campaign, which is the nation has never decided it wants to be a place where we the people means all the people.
Well, and
that's
nor
the
have
point
we,
of my campaign.
But nor have Native people decided that. And so when I look at something like the Indian Citizenship Act, that's a declaration declaring we're citizens. It's not a granting of citizenship. And so when I hear people say, "Well, we became citizens in 1924," I ask that question: did we? I mean, the Haudenosaunee actually took a position when the first draft notices showed up for World War II. Well, you can't draft us, and that's why again they went through a little bit of a PR campaign to declare war individually. But I mean, this whole notion that so when you ask that question, when did the United States decide that we the people should include Native people? There's no date. Even the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. Right? I mean, go back farther yet. You go to the 14th Amendment. We obviously weren't covered by the 14th Amendment. That's why they tried the Citizenship Act. And the Citizenship Act didn't do it either because in 1934 they tried the Indian Reorganization Act. So once again, they acknowledged that we had not all became U.S. citizens. And even today, they'll look back today and they'll say, well, if you're trying to get land placed into trust, you can't have land placed into trust unless you can prove in 1934 you were under the jurisdiction of the United States. Well, if we were made U.S. citizens in 24, and then in 1934 they passed this Indian Reorganization Act. How is it that there still could have been Native people who are not under the jurisdiction unless they recognize that our distinction still very much did exist?
And I would say that is the exact conversation I'm trying to raise. The heart of my campaign is I am saying we need a national dialogue on race, gender, and class, a conversation I would put on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that happened in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I would call ours Truth and Conciliation because, again, reconciliation is a misnomer. It implies there was a previous harmony, which clearly didn't exist here. Steve Newcomb points that out very clearly in his book. And so the question I'm saying is, and you can answer it from both sides. Yes, the nation has never decided it really wants to include people of color, natives, Africans, and others in their understanding of who's a citizen of this place. And you can also argue it from our community standpoint and say, yeah, we never fully agreed that we wanted to be citizens. And so we've never had this debate. We've never had the actual conversation on a national level with input from all sides that says, is this what we want to be?
Well, let me ask you this.
I would love it. I would love it if our people would come to the table and if they feel strongly to say, I don't want to be a citizen of this nation, but I'm not leaving because this is where my community is and this is where my land is and this is where our home has been since before Columbus got lost at sea, then absolutely we have to figure that out.
Well, so then tell me this. So do you support both the again, full assimilation of Native people and the full distinction of Native people at the same time? I mean, would you recognize the sovereignty?
We have to decide what we want to be.
Well,
we've never decided this.
Well, who's we?
We've had the nation and
wait. I'm sorry. What you mean, the United States or Native people?
I'm saying both.
Because there are many Native territories that assert over and over again that they are distinct from the United States and that their lands are not part of the United States. And in fact, the argument that you can make out of the doctrine of discovery, and of course the racist land title law that comes from Johnson v. McIntosh and other places, is that we have a rightful claim for our lands to be distinct. In fact, there is very little evidence to suggest that the United States ever lawfully even with the doctrine of discovery and Johnson v. McIntosh and all that stuff, there are many territories like Haudenosaunee lands where treaties say the United States recognized that our land is ours and they were never claimed the same. Yet we still end up in this place where there are many people say, well, yeah, we were made citizens in 1924, and never said, well, the United States declared we were citizens, but not necessarily we didn't all necessarily embrace it. So I guess if you're running if you're the president of the United States, will you recognize the distinction and the sovereignty, not just tribal sovereignty, but real sovereignty for Native people who choose to be separate and distinct from the United States?
That is the conversation I want everyone in Turtle Island to have through this Truth and Conciliation Commission. What I'm saying is we've never. Yes, we've had different sides, and the U.S. has enacted policy here, and in some places Native communities have pushed back, in other places they've submitted to it, but there hasn't necessarily been a formal decision of this nation wants to actually become citizens, and this nation wants to be outside of that citizenship. This is what I'm saying. This is the conversation we have to have, and it's it's going to be a difficult conversation to have, but we've never had it.
Well, and in fact, it's all been assumption. I mean, and that's what we've seen historically
Absolutely.
With the United States, assuming over and over and over again that Native people. I mean, to back up to Johnson v. McIntosh, if you recall, one of the other comments that Justice John Marshall makes is that however pretentious or extravagant the pretension is to equate native or discovery of an inhabited land with conquest, if we can assert it in the first instance and sustain it, then it becomes law of the land. So he essentially says merely discovering us was the same as conquest, even though there's plenty of contradiction in treaties. Like I said, I mentioned the Canandaigua Treaty, but there's language all over the place that dances on both sides of this notion of whether Native people were distinct or whether we were conquered, whether we were citizens or whether we're not. So most of this is all born out of assumption. And so when when your platform is all about trying to embrace this we the people, I don't hear a whole lot of language about whether where there's distinction and where the recognition of native sovereignty for those native peoples and those native territories that want to fight for their land to be distinct and want to fight for their citizenship. Look at the Haudenosaunee denied the right to travel on their own passports, for instance. These are the things that if we're only going to embrace this we the people, it's almost like, well, we want full assimilation. We don't want this partial or this racial discrimination. We want full assimilation, and I'm not sure that's where many people, especially if the question is posed that way, I don't know how many people are going to say, no, I'll surrender my Navajo citizenship and place that beneath beneath subjugation to the United States. I don't think that a whole lot of people will do that.
Yeah, and that's where you saw on my press release, I identify myself as a dual citizen of the United States and the Navajo Nation. And that is why the first thing I'm laying out that we need this national dialogue. In his final State of the Union, President Obama, in his speech, he was addressing the need for new politics in the United States. And he said, we the people. Our Constitution begins with these three simple words. Words we've come to recognize mean all the people. And I heard that, and I immediately said, when? When did we decide? I've studied our history in depth. I cannot pinpoint a single place.
Well, and the question remains: when did we as Native people decide that that subjugation or that inclusion was imposed upon us to the extent that we can no longer question it? And I think that is also a big question.
That's the part of it. This is what I'm saying, and I'm saying this as a member of the Navajo Nation and as a citizen of the United States. I'm the son of both my father and my mother, and I'm saying we've never had this dialogue.
Yeah, but
I think it's time we had it.
Let me back that up, though, because let's face it, as even the claim for dual citizenship places the Native identity beneath that of the United States. That's just the way the United States policy is, and it's not just about. And that's where because like I said, the United States feels that we are. I mean, their definition of a federally recognized tribe is a tribe, band, or nation of Indians subordinate to the laws of the United States. There's nothing.
Yes, even though domestic dependent.
They have no place where they can say when that happens. There's no date. There's no treaty. There's no agreement on a consent from Native people to say, okay, we're yours now. So, I mean, but I understand what you're saying. I know because we're running out of time, there are a couple things I want to address specifically. Obviously, in your TED Talk, you mentioned, you talked about the racism, the white supremacy associated with the doctrine of discovery. But you also went on to say that the Declaration of Independence is a systematically white supremacist document. So you make that statement, and then you go on and you say the U.S. Constitution is a systematically white supremacist and sexist document. My question is, how does a guy run for president when he takes that view of these revered documents of American history? I mean, it begs the question: how do you possibly expect to? Because you're not even trying to do damage control. You believe that to be the case going forward. How does a person run for president who views the U.S. Constitution as a racist or white supremacist document?
Well, this is one of the dialogues I'm trying to bring to the forefront. Most of our citizens, most U.S. citizens, have never read the documents that they claim to be governed by. They don't actually know what they say.
No, they know the Pledge of Allegiance and maybe the first verse of the national anthem, as far as it goes.
So if you want to become an elected official, if you want to work for the U.S. government, if you want to join the military, you have to take a pledge to protect and defend a document. Now, if you're a person of color, if you're a woman, if you don't identify in the binary gender definitions, you have to hope that this document says something that it doesn't actually contain.
Well, and that's my question.
That's
If
the problem.
you're going to lay your hand on a Bible, and then you're going to swear an oath to defend and uphold the U.S. Constitution that you view specifically as both a white supremacist and sexist document, and so I wonder, how do you reconcile that?
Well, so on my website, which is wirelesshogan.com, this is my personal website. I have, you could say, a draft of the Constitution, where I went through and I actually took out a lot of the sexist and racist languages. And again, not proposing them as amendments, but as edits. Right now, this country has a document that is written in the language and the worldview of the 1800s. And it was a very sexist, white supremacist, racist worldview and language. And we've never updated it. We've never corrected that.
Well, I mean, they add to it. They make amendments, and they try to do these things. But again, they don't revisit some of the. I mean, it's like building, more, just piling it on rather than removing any of this stuff. I guess my question for the U.S. Constitution, from a Native standpoint, is I don't understand why the U.S. Constitution, or why you view the U.S. Constitution as being anti-Native, because just because we weren't included. That would have been the right assumption in the 1790s, it seems to me.
And I welcome you to bring that argument to the table.
All right, so I got to ask you three basic questions then. Well, first off, I mean, we've talked about you running for president. Why would a white person want to vote for you? I mean,
have a deep understanding.
Understanding
most of
the view of the Constitution, which some of these people hold so dear. I mean, what would what would be the incentive for a white person to vote for you?
Because America is basically constructed under a myth. There's a myth of American exceptionalism. There's a myth of America is the good guys. There's a myth of America is the good countering the evil of the world. And that myth is, it's a myth. That history isn't true. We are one of the top 10, if not the greatest genocidal nations.
I don't think you're winning white votes here, though.
No, but to keep up the myth, to perpetuate the myth, to keep running, to keep living, and to hold yourself together under what you know deep down to be false.
Yeah, and let's be honest. This American exceptionalism is the modern day version of white supremacy. I mean, it's
yes.
I mean,
it's the coping mechanism for a nation that doesn't know what to do with its genocidal past and its current racist reality.
So rather than being superior, genetically superior, we're going to say that they are what, historically superior. So that's kind of where that comes from. So I mean, let me go farther. So why would a Native person vote for you then?
Why would a Native person?
Yeah, I mean, if what you're really, because be honest, I mean, you really are kind of promoting this idea about equality within the same government that committed these atrocious acts. So everything from genocidal massacres to genocidal residential schools to policies that still have our lands being raped and manipulated. So why would, if what you're promoting is more inclusion, which essentially would make us almost meaningless in the American electorate. Our population is so small, we would have no say over our lands if we were fully integrated into American society. We would essentially disappear almost just with that.
And this is why, at the heart of my campaign, I'm proposing this national dialogue on race, gender, and class, this Truth and Conciliation Commission. When South Africa had their Truth and Conciliation Commission, they wrote a whole new constitution. This is the level of change that we need to talk about as a nation, and we need to decide what to do. And we need to decide, and Native nations need to decide, do we want to be a part of this union? Do we not? Do we need to, this is the conversation we need to have.
Well, and of course the difference
And
between Africa and here is, in Africa, black people represented the majority. Here we've had our numbers decimated. So, even to come up with conciliation, we're never going to get our population back or our lands back. I mean, Africa, black people got control of their lives and their lands and their resources back. I mean, that was the effort there. The likelihood of that happening right now, just the idea of trying to carve out enough. I mean, even to get the United States to fully embrace the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, where our consent is required. We can't even get the United States to agree to that.
Yeah. And this is the conversation I'm trying to bring to the forefront.
Well, so that's essentially you're running for president is an effort to really advance. To advance this conversation more so than obviously the likelihood of winning. You're running as an independent, is that correct?
I'm running as an independent.
Okay.
And my goal is for the nation I live in, for my mother's people and my father's people, to have this dialogue that it's never had before. Because something has to change.
Well, I would argue the dialogue has happened, but it never gets brought up, like you said, to the national level, and that's
where I'm saying. I'm saying this is an effort to bring it to the national level.
Well, I wish you luck in what you're trying to do. Although I will say that I still think the reason the biggest reason for promoting awareness about the doctrine of discovery is to assert our right for a free and independent existence, not necessarily for. I don't even understand the argument about exposing the doctrine of discovery and then using that as the premise for full full equal assimilation into the very peoples and systems that utilize these racist doctrines to take our lands, to take our freedom, to oftentimes kill our people. I think the idea of trying to expose that a nation that was supposed to have a separation of church and state use this church dogma to commit crimes that, and if what we're calling conciliation for those crimes is okay, now we'll just be part of you. I'm not sure. That's where I still struggle.
And this is the conversation that we've never had, and I'm convinced we need to have this dialogue, and we need to have it not in the local communities where we've been having it. We need to have it at a national level.
Well, I don't disagree with that.
And the nation needs to decide, and Native peoples need to come to the table and be full partners and equal in that conversation.
Well, whether your candidacy does this or not, I'd love to participate in a conversation on a national level, so people understand both levels of this. Both for those Native people who want to fully embrace their patriotism and loyalty to the very country that was never returned the same, and to those of us who want to maintain, yes, that we are distinct and we have a right, legal, morally, scientifically, we have a right to exist as a distinct people from the United States. And that doesn't mean that it has to be isolationist. It just means that that there should be some recognition and respect given to that.
And I want to create a space where all sides of that argument can come and be empowered to express their arguments, express what they feel. And because this is the conversation we need to have. We've buried that conversation for centuries. We've assumed things, we've enacted things, we've subjugated people, we've elevated other people.
By we, you mean the United States has done that?
The United States of America, yes.
Okay.
But also, we've, as Native peoples, we've been subjugated to these things.
Well, I mean, again, to quote Ruth Bader Ginsburg, as you cited in your TED talk, I mean, when she makes the reference to when the Oneidas were talking about trying to unify their lands back to them and reclaim the lands, and they said preclude tribes from rekindling embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. I mean, essentially, that's almost what assimilation does. That it eliminates it eliminates this notion of not only land being in the sovereign possession of native peoples, but our existence being able to exist as a distinct people. So I don't think any native people, even those who at some level embrace a level of assimilation, I don't think any of them want their sovereignty to be considered something as embers having grown cold. I think many of us, and I don't know where within the system, the American system, that those two things can coexist. I think it oftentimes does get put into an all or nothing proposition, and that's where I see John Kane and Mark Charles being on perhaps on separate conversations there, because it is almost an all or nothing proposition.
And I am, after living on our reservation for over 11 years and studying this doctrine and looking at the history with the church and looking at my own family and my own history, I feel that not that there's no guarantee what I'm trying to do is going to be successful. No guarantee at all. But I think it represents one of the better chances we have of actually trying to get the dialogue to go somewhere.
Because I'm even disappointed in what Canada achieved with their Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Oh, I would agree.
And in fact, whether we're talking about evaluating residential schools or missing and murdered Indigenous women, we still see a continuation of that same philosophy or ideology that produced the genocide, that continues to address, even as they try to address genocide, it still has that racist and white supremacist overtone to it.
Yeah, and I so many of these movements, you could make the argument, whether it's the Truth and Reconciliation in Canada or even some aspects of the civil rights movement here in the U.S., they provide opportunities for the majority culture to participate in a dialogue and fix it in a way so it doesn't really go anywhere.
Well, and again, I think what sometimes people confuse the difference between human rights and civil rights. Civil rights are essentially rights within the system, right? It's within what is considered the norms of that civil society. Human rights are really a right bestowed by creation, not necessarily by man's law. So when we talk about civil rights, I mean, and this is the difference between what a black man in the United States is fighting for, or any other people of color who embrace their American citizenship or are trying to fight for rights within American citizenship, and Native people who oftentimes, if not even fully understanding it, are still trying to fight for their distinction more so than full inclusion or equality within the civil society.
Well, and we have two large groups of people in the U.S. who never, who had this nation imposed upon them. The first is obviously Native Americans, who are quote unquote discovered. And then we have our African Americans who are brought here as slaves. And both of these groups of people had U.S. citizenship enacted upon them out of the quote-unquote benevolence of the country.
Well, and we could argue that actually most of the black population was bred in the United States. Only about 500,000 Africans were brought to North America. The rest, they were all bred in captivity. And so you're right. But I agree. It is an imposed culture upon a people.
It's an imposed system. And we have to deal with that. This is what makes these two communities a very unique. We talk about the nation. We'll talk about this as a nation of immigrants. Well, that marginalizes, dehumanizes, or disregards the position of our native communities who never immigrated here. And it disregards the history with African people who were brought here as slaves.
Yeah, they certainly didn't immigrate. They were they were.
And so even the way the nation talks about its foundation, which is we're a nation of immigrants, that's not true.
Yeah, no, I agree with that completely. And and of course, this is where we as Native people, living in a world where the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is passed in 2007, voted against by the United States and Canada and New Zealand and Australia, still see countries like the United States and Canada operating in stark violation of almost all of the articles of that. I realize it's a non-binding declaration, but the fact that we can't even have that conversation, where the rest of the world has, at least at some level, embraced this notion that there should be a minimum standard that the nation states of the world should recognize for the survival and dignity of Native peoples, and we're not even there. So, and that doesn't even carve out things like sovereignty and distinction necessarily as even the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is about inclusion. It's not necessarily about distinction, and so it's certainly not a panacea for the problem. But we can't even get the United States to accept the minimum standards that the UN, the international community, has put forth.
Yeah. And if you listen, in my announcement video, I phrased my campaign the next 18 months between now and November of 2020. This is an 18-month dialogue, an 18-month journey. And I want to use the next 18 months to not just lay out my policies, but to actually educate our nation on its history. And because most Americans, most U.S. citizens do not know the history of their nation, they accept this mythology that's been presented, which is a false mythology. And therefore, we end up not actually being able to solve the problems we're facing because no one wants to bring the conversation down to the foundational level. U.S. citizens tend to believe that this nation is white supremacist, racist, and sexist in spite of our foundations. In other words, the foundations were good and we just messed them up. And I'm telling people, no, the United States is white supremacist, racist, and sexist because of our foundations. Like these thoughts, this worldview, this language is embedded into them. And we have to deal with that. And this is the history I'm trying to teach, and it's out of this history that we can now, I'm hoping, have a more productive dialogue about how do we fix the problems.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if being president of the United States will do that, but I guess we'll see how your dialogue goes over the next 18 months. I want to thank you for giving me so much of your time to talk about. And these are tough subjects, you and I represent. I'm not saying opposite ends of a spectrum, but certainly different places on a spectrum about Native existence, identity, and that kind of thing. I frankly do not consider myself a U.S. citizen. I consider myself Ungwe. I consider myself Gunyagahaga, the people of the land of Flint, Mohawk, and I think the idea that I have to embrace a dual citizenship where my personal identity stands beneath or subjugated on another citizenship. I mean, the idea that the international community won't push back on the United States for things like our ability to produce our own travel documents and that kind of stuff. These are some of the problems that kind of show that the United States places themselves in the driver's seat, not only in terms of world domination with military presence all over, but in terms of how nations interact with each other. And this is a challenge. But Mark Charles, I want to thank you for joining me. I know you've given me much more time than you probably signed up for. Thank you for bantering with me on these conversations, and stay in touch.
John, I appreciate you. I have great respect for the show you're doing and for the work you're doing. And one of my goals is to create a dialogue where, whether it's you and me or even other people coming from different spaces, can actually sit down and have this conversation and discuss these things and find a way forward.
I'd love to do it.
Thank you for having me.
Love to do it.
I look forward to having more conversations.
All right. You take care of yourself. Travel well.
Okay.
All right.
Take care.
All right. On up. Okay. There you have that. You can go and kill that. Yeah. All right. First off, there's a lot that I could try to unpack, but there's just a few things that I have to clear up here. Can we stop with the dual citizenship BS? I mean, let's. This isn't like being a French citizen and a U.S. citizen, where when you go to France, you can live as a French citizen, and when you go back to the United States, you can live as a U.S. citizen. No, on our territories, the United States does not recognize our distinction as citizens of our respective nations. They still try to impose federal income tax on our, even if you work for your own government. The Seneca Nation counselors, they pay federal income tax. They don't want to, but we feel compelled to do that. So this notion that where anytime a Native person says that they claim dual citizenship, no, you're just placing your Native ancestry beneath this whole notion of U.S. patriarchy. I mean, and there's no way around it. It's kind of ridiculous to even suggest that you can claim that you're a citizen of the Navajo Nation on your father's side and a citizen of the United States on your mother's side, because you just placed all of your father's ancestries squarely beneath your mother's, and that's where I have a bit of a problem with that. One other thing, and I'm sorry I missed it, but I've said this before: cultural genocide is not a thing. Just because the United States ceased to do the mass slaughters of Native people and instead decide to abuse our children or us as children in residential schools, that doesn't make it just cultural genocide. There are people that lost their lives in those schools. There are people who were abused, sexually abused, physically abused, psychologically abused. There are people who died trying to escape these prison camps for all intents and purposes. So, I take a certain offense to this notion that we can somehow, again, sound like, oh, we don't have a stomach for using the word genocide. We don't have the stomach for that. So we're gonna stick the word cultural in front of it. Now, I have a bit of a problem with that. So, the other thing I got to say about Mark Charles is clearly he knows history, and his knowledge of history isn't the problem. The problem is the conclusions that he draws from that history. The fact that he refers to the founding fathers as his founding fathers. The fact that he refers to the U.S. Constitution as his U.S. Constitution. All of these, foundational documents he claims as his. Now, is he just, channeling his mother, or is this his identity? Well, clearly it's his identity. He's trying to run for the president of the United States. Obviously, look, the reason for people to run for the presidency, there's a couple of reasons to do it. One is to win. That's not what Mark Charles is running for. He's trying to make a statement. He's trying to, and perhaps there's some value in the conversation that he's trying to have. The difficulty is, I was trying to have that conversation here, and he keeps saying, well, that's the conversation I want to have. Well, we're having the conversation. And it was very difficult to pin him down on certain things, like, where he comes, what his position is on the idea of lands not being a part of the United States, or people not being a part of the United States, because we don't claim dual citizenship. We claim our native identity, not somehow placing it underneath the United States. So this was it was an interesting conversation. I don't think this this show was going to advance his chances of becoming the president of the United States. I don't think he had much of a chance of becoming the president of the United States. We reached out to Mark Charles because I was pretty much, disturbed by some of the conclusions he draws from the doctrine of discovery. The idea that he thinks that the doctrine of discovery is merely something that we should put out there to create white guilt for better treatment. Like I said, I don't need any more U.S. laws, passed relating to me. I don't want the United States to pass laws, special Indian legislation. I want them to roll some of it back. The whole goal for folks like me is to say, no, you don't have to legislate over us or for us or around us. You need to recognize that we have a right to a free and independent existence. That's the reason for calling out the doctrine of Christian discovery. The reason for exposing the injustice and the racism associated with not only that church dogma, but the fact that it becomes codified into U.S. law. That's the reason for bringing that up, is for making our case for distinction, not for making our case for better inclusion so we can be we the people. So, I mean, that's how Mark Charles got on my radar in the first place. Obviously, this interview wasn't just an interview to assist him to become president of the United States. That's not going to happen. But it was a meaningful conversation. I would love to be a part of a panel discussion where there's a Mark Charles on a panel and there's a John Kane on that panel. So I don't know. We'll see if that can ever happen. Hey, look, before I go here, let me mention my sponsors. I want to thank the sponsors of Let's Talk Native, Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, some other good folks from another Native company that very much supports the show. And there used to be the occasional check in the mail that would show up. I haven't seen many of those lately, and we could use them. We've got some things we're going to try to do with the studio to make interviews like the one with Mark Charles more possible. So look, if you like what we've done here, we're looking for your support to help us continue to do improvements and produce a better product. As I said, we're entering in our 10th year of Let's Talk Native here, and that's not a short time. And so we've been doing this for a good long time. I want to thank those people who have made that possible over the years, not just the current sponsors, but past sponsors. I also want to thank those of you who allow us to share our Facebook live stream on your group pages. I want to thank all of you who share the Facebook live stream, the podcast, the YouTube videos. We've got a really great video coming out this week that I think should get some pretty good attention, and I'm hoping that many of you will check it out. I call it the RBG on DOD, Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the Doctrine of Discovery. So we'll release that this week, and I'm hoping that many of you will check it out and share that. I am heading to New York, doing a screening out in Long Island tomorrow night. I do want to mention that just confirmed that at the end of this month I will be having Jeff Doreen and Laura Kuji joining me for my June event in New York, in Brooklyn, at the Brooklyn Commons. That'll be on June 27th. Around 7 o'clock, we'll set up and we'll get started down at the Brooklyn Commons with Jeff Doreen and Laura Kuji, who helps Jeff sing backup for his Beatles tunes done in Mohawk, and then Jeff does backup for her as she does some of her spoken word performances. So look forward to that. It was a great show they did last time, and we look forward to another great show from these guys as we enter into the summer months here. So again, you can check out my show in New York on WBAI.org. We Facebook live stream those shows as well, and you can look for us live. That's Thursday at 4 p.m. from 4 to 5 p.m. And that's a talkback show, so you'll get a chance to hear some callers call in as well. So check us out. That's Let's Talk with John Kane on WBAI in New York City. That's Thursdays from 4 to 5 p.m. And again, I want to remind people, go to our webpage, go to letstalknative.com. I look for us on Twitter, look for us on Facebook, and make sure that you share our videos and you offer some comments on what we produce here. I want to thank you for listening. And again, I want to give my thanks to Mark Charles for having joined us today. We'll see you next time. Yahweh.